The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls, pages 147 to 155. That fall when I was going into the 10th grade, Miss Bivens made me the news editor of the Maroon Wave. After working as a proofreader in the 7th grade, I started laying out pages in the 8th grade, and in the 9th grade I began reporting and writing articles and taking photographs. Mom had bought a Minolta camera to take pictures of her pictures so she could send them to Lori, who could show them around art galleries in New York. When Mom wasn't using it, I wore the Minolta everywhere, because you never knew when you'd see something newsworthy. What I loved most about calling myself a reporter was that it gave me an excuse to show up any place. Since I'd never made a lot of friends in Welch, I hardly ever went to the school's football games or dances or rallies. I felt awkward sitting by myself when everyone else was with friends. But when I was working for the Wave, I had a reason to be there. I was on assignment, a member of the working press, with my notepad in hand and the Minolta around my neck. I began going to just about every extracurricular event at the school, and the kids who shunned me before now accepted me, and even sought me out, posing and clowning in hopes of getting their picture in the paper. As someone who could make them famous among their peers, I was no longer a person to be trifled with. Even though the Wave came out only once a month, I worked on it every day. Instead of hiding in the bathroom during lunch hour, I spent it in Miss Bivens' classroom, where I wrote my articles, edited the stories written by other students, and counted the letters and headlines to make sure they fit the columns. I finally had a good excuse for why I never ate lunch. I'm on deadline, I'd say. I also stayed after school to develop my photographs in the darkroom, and that had a hidden benefit. I could sneak into the cafeteria once everyone had left and dig through the garbage pails. I'd find industrial-sized cans of corn that were nearly full and huge containers of coleslaw and tapioca pudding. I no longer had to root through the bathroom wastebaskets for food, and I hardly ever went hungry again. When I was a junior, Miss Bivens made me the editor-in-chief, though the job was supposed to go to a senior. Only a handful of students wanted to work for the Wave, and I ended up writing so many of the articles that I abolished bylines. It looked like a little ridiculous having my name appear 4 times on the front page. The paper cost 15 cents, and I sold it myself, going from class to class and standing in the hallways, hawking it like a newsboy. Welch High had about 1,200 students, but we sold only a couple hundred copies of paper. I tried various schemes to boost the circulation. I held poetry competitions, added a fashion column, and wrote controversial editorials, including one questioning the validity of standardized tests, which provoked an irate letter from the head of the State Department of Education. Nothing worked. One day a student I was trying to get to buy the Wave told me he had no use for it because the same names appeared in the paper again and again. The school's athletes and cheerleaders and a handful of kids known as slide rolls who always won the academic prizes. So I started a column called Birthday Corner, listing the names of the 80 or so people who had their birthday in the coming month. Most of these people had never appeared in the paper, and they were so excited to see their names in print. They bought several copies. Circulation doubled. Miss Bivens wondered out loud if Birthday Corner represented serious journalism. I told her I didn't care. It sold papers. Chuck Yeager visited Welch High that year. I'd been hearing about Chuck Yeager all my life from Dad, about how he'd been born in West Virginia in the town of Myra on the Mud River over in Lincoln County, about how he joined the Air Force during World War II and had shot down 11 German planes by the time he was 22, about how he became a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base high up on the Mojave Desert in California, and how one day in 1947 he became the first man to break the sound barrier in his X-1, even though the night before he'd been up drinking and had been thrown from a horse and cracked some ribs. Dad would never admit to having heroes, but the brass-balled, liquor-loving, coolly calculating Chuck Yeager was the one man in the world he admired above all others. When he heard that Chuck Yeager was giving a speech at Welch High and he'd agreed to let me interview him afterward, Dad could hardly contain his excitement. He was waiting on the porch for me with a pen and paper when I got home from school the day before the big interview. He sat down to help me drop a list of intelligent questions so I wouldn't embarrass myself in front of this greatest of West Virginia's native sons. What was going through your head when you first broke Mach 1? What was going through your head when A. Scott Crossfield broke Mach 2? What's your favorite aircraft? What are your thoughts on the feasibility of flying at the speed of light? Dad wrote up 25 or 30 questions like that and then insisted we rehearse the interview. He pretended to be Chuck Yeager and gave me detailed answers to the questions he'd written out. His eyes got misty as he described what it was like to break the sound barrier. Then he decided I needed some solid grounding in aviation history, and if he stayed up half the night briefing me by the light of a kerosene lamp on the test flight program, basic aerodynamics, and the Austrian physicist Ernst Mach. The next day, Mr. Jack, the principal, introduced Chuck Yeager during assembly in the auditorium. He looked more like a cowboy than a West Virginian, with his horseman's gait and his lean, leathery face, but as soon as he started speaking, his voice was pure Apollo. And as he talked, the fidgety students settled into their folding chairs and became enraptured by the legendary world-traveled man who told us how proud he was of his West Virginia roots, and how we, too, should be proud of those roots we all shared, and how regardless of where we came from, each and every one of us could and should follow our dreams, just as he had followed his. When he finished talking, the applause about shattered the glass in the windows. I climbed up on the stage before the students filed out. "Mr. Yeager," I said, holding out my hand, "I'm Jeanette Walls with the Maroon Wave." Chuck Yeager took my hand and grinned. "Just spell my name right, ma'am," he said, "so's McKen'll know who you're writing about." When we sat down on some folding chairs and talked for nearly an hour, Mr. Yeager took every question seriously and acted like he had all the time in the world for me. When I mentioned various aircraft he'd flown, the aircraft Dad had briefed me about, he grinned and said, "Heck, I do believe we've got an aviation expert on our hands." In the hallways afterward, the other kids kept coming up to tell me how lucky I was. "What was he really like?" they asked. "What did he say?" Everyone treated me with the deference accorded only to the school's top athletes. Even the varsity quarterback caught my eye and nodded. I was the girl who'd actually talked to Chuck Yeager. Dad was so eager to hear how the interview went that he was not only home when I got back from school, he was even sober. He insisted on helping me with the article to ensure its technical accuracy. I already had a lead figured out in my head. I sat down in front of Mom's Remington and typed it out. The pages of the history books came alive this month when Chuck Yeager, the man who first broke the sound barrier, visited Welch High. Dad looked over my shoulder. "Great," he said, "but let's juice it up a little bit." Lori had been writing to us regularly from New York. She loved it there. She was living in a hotel for women in Greenwich Village, working as a waitress in a German restaurant and taking art classes and even fencing lessons. She'd met the most fascinating group of people, every one of them a weird genius. People in New York loved art and music so much, she said, that artists sold paintings right on the sidewalk next to string quartets playing Mozart. Even Central Park wasn't as dangerous as people in West Virginia thought. On the weekends, it was filled with roller skaters and frisbee players and jugglers and mimes with their faces painted white. She knew I'd love it once I got there. I knew it too. Ever since I started 11th grade, I'd been counting off the months, 22 of them, until I would join Lori. I had my plan worked out. Once I graduated from high school, I'd move to New York, enroll at a city college, then get a job with AP or UPI, the wire services whose stories unspooled from the Welch Daily News teletype machines, or with one of the famous New York papers. I'd overhear the reporters at the Welch Daily News make jokes to one another about the highfalutin writers who worked at those papers. I was determined to become one. In the middle of my junior year, I went to Miss Katona, the high school guidance counselor, to ask for the names of colleges in New York. Miss Katona lifted the glasses that dangled from a cord around her neck and peered at me through them. Bluefield State was only 36 miles away, she said. With my grades, I could probably get a full scholarship. "I want to go to college in New York," I said. Miss Katona gave me a puzzled frown. "Whatever for?" "That's where I want to live." Miss Katona said that in her view, this was a bad idea. It was easier to go to college in the state where you'd attended high school. You were considered in-state, which meant acceptance was more likely and tuition was cheaper. I thought about this for a minute. Maybe I should move to New York City right now and graduate from high school there. Then I'd be considered in-state. Miss Katona squinted at me. "But you live here," she said. "This is your home." Miss Katona was a fine-boned woman who always wore button-up sweaters and stout shoes. She had gone to Welch High School, and it seemed not to have occurred to her to live anywhere else. To leave West Virginia, even to leave Welch, would have been unthinkably disloyal, like deserting your family. "Just because I live here now," I said, "doesn't mean I couldn't move. That would be a terrible mistake. You live here. Think of what you'd miss, your family and friends, your senior year is the highlight of your entire high school experience. You'd miss senior day. You'd miss senior prom." I walked home slowly that evening, thinking over what Miss Katona had said. It was true that many grown-ups in Welch had talked about how senior year in high school was the highlight of their lives. On senior day, something the school had set up to keep juniors from dropping out, the seniors wore funny clothes, got to skip classes. It was not exactly a compelling reason to stay on in Welch for one more year. As for the senior prom, I had about as much chance of getting a date as Dad did of ending corruption in the unions. I'd been speaking hypothetically about moving to New York a year early, but as I walked, I realized if I wanted to, I could up and go. I could really do it. Maybe not right now, not this minute. It was the middle of a school year, but I could wait until I finished 11th grade. By then I'd be 17. I had almost $100 saved, enough to get me started in New York. I could leave Welch in under 5 months. I got so excited I started running. I ran faster and faster along the old road overhung with bare branch trees, then onto Grandview and up Little Hobart Street, past the barking yard dogs and the frost-covered coal piles, past the Noyes house, past the Parrish's house, the Hall's house, and the Rinko's house, until, gasping for air, I came to a stop in front of our house. For the first time in years, I noticed my half-finished yellow paint job. I'd spent so much time in Welch trying to make things a little bit better, but nothing had worked. In fact, the house was getting worse. One of the supporting pillars was starting to buckle. The leak in the roof over Brian's bed had gotten so bad that when it rained, he slept under an inflatable raft Mom had won in a sweepstakes by sending in Benson and Hedges 100s packages we dug out of trash cans. If I left, Brian could have my own bed. My mind was made up. I was going to New York City as soon as the school year was out. I clambered up the mountainside to the rear of the house. The stairs had completely rotted through, and climbed through the back window we now used as a door. Dad was at the drafting table working on some calculations, and Mom was going through her stacks of paintings. When I told them about my plan, Dad stubbed out his cigarette, stood up, and climbed out the back window without saying a word. Mom nodded and looked down, dusting off one of her paintings, murmuring something to herself. "So what do you think?" I asked. "Fine. Go." "What's wrong?" "Nothing. You should go. It's a good plan." She seemed on the verge of tears. "Don't be sad, Mom. All right." "Not upset because I'll miss you," Mom said. "I'm upset because you get to go to New York and I'm stuck here. It's not fair." Lori, when I called her, approved of my plan. I could live with her, she said, if I got a job and chipped in on the rent. Brian liked my idea, too, especially when I pointed out that he could have my bed. He began making wisecracks in a lockjaw accent about how I was going to become one of those fur-wearing, pinky-extending, nose-in-the-air New Yorkers. He began counting down the weeks until he left, just as I had counted them down for Lori. "In 16 weeks, you'll be in New York," he said. The next week. "In 3 months and 3 weeks, you'll be in New York." Dad had barely spoken to me since I announced my decision. One night that spring, he came into the bedroom where I was up on my bunk studying. He had some papers rolled up under his arm. "Got a minute to look at something?" he asked. "Sure." I followed him into the living room where he spread out the papers on the drafting table. They were his old blueprints for the glass castle, all stained and dog-eared. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen them. We'd stopped talking about the glass castle once the foundation we dug was filled up with garbage. "I think I finally worked out how to deal with the lack of sunlight on the hillside," Dad said. "It involved installing specially curved mirrors in the solar cells. But what he wanted to talk to me about was the plans for my room. Now that Lori's gone," he said, "I'm reconfiguring the layout and your room will be a lot bigger." Dad's hands trembled slightly as he unrolled different blueprints. He'd drawn frontal views, side views, and aerial views of the glass castle. He'd diagrammed the wiring and the plumbing. He had drawn the interiors of rooms and labeled them and specified their dimensions down to the inches in his precise, blocky handwriting. I stared at the plans. "Dad," I said, "you'll never build the glass castle." "Are you saying you don't have faith in your old man?" "Even if you do, I'll be gone. In less than 3 months, I'm leaving for New York City." "What I was thinking was that you don't have to go right away," Dad said. "I could stay and graduate from Welch High and go to Bluefield State, as Miss Katona had suggested, then get a job at the Welch Daily News. He'd help me with the articles, like he'd help me with my piece on Chuck Yeager. And I'll build a glass castle, I swear it. We'll all live in it together. It'll be a hell of a lot better than any apartment you'll ever find in New York City. I can guarantee that." "Dad," I said, "as soon as I finish classes, I'm getting on the next bus out of here. If the buses stop running, I'll hitchhike. I'll walk if I have to. Go ahead and build the glass castle, but don't do it for me." Dad rolled up the blueprints and walked out of the room. A minute later, I heard him scrambling down the mountainside. It had been a mild winter, and summer came early to the mountains. By late May, the wild bleeding hearts and the rhododendrons had bloomed, and the fragrance of honeysuckle drifted down the hillside and into the house. We had our first hot days before school was out. Those last couple of weeks, I'd go from feeling excited to nervous to just plain scared back to excited in a matter of minutes. On the last day of school, I cleaned out my locker and went to say goodbye to Miss Bivens. "I've got a feeling about you," she said. "I think you'll do all right up there. But you've left me with a problem. Who's going to edit the Wave next year? You'll find someone, I'm sure. I thought of trying to entice your brother into it. People might start thinking that the Wallses are building a dynasty." Miss Bivens smiled. "Maybe you are." At home that night, Mom cleaned out a suitcase she'd used for a collection of dancing shoes, and I filled it with my clothes and my bound copies of the Maroon Wave. I wanted to leave everything from the past behind, even the good things, so I gave Maureen my geode. It was dusty and dull, but I told her that if she scrubbed it hard, it would sparkle like a diamond. As I cleared out the box on the wall next to my bed, Brian said, "Guess what? In one more day, you'll be going to New York City." Then he started impersonating Frank Sinatra, singing New York, New York, off-key, and doing his lounge lizard dance. "Shut up, you big dummy," I said, and hit him hard on the shoulder. "You're the dummy," he said, and hit me hard back. We tossed a few more punches and then looked at each other awkwardly. The one bus out of Welch left at 7:10 in the morning. I needed to be at the station before 7. Mom announced that since she was not by nature an early riser, she would not be getting up to see me off. "I know what you look like, and I know what the bus station looks like," she said, "and those big farewells are so sentimental." I could hardly sleep that night. Neither could Brian. From time to time, he'd break the silence by announcing that in 7 hours I'd be leaving Welch. In 6 hours I'd be leaving Welch, and we'd both start cracking up. I fell asleep only to be woken at first light by Brian, who, like Mom, wasn't an early riser. He was tugging at my arm. "No more joking about it," he said. "In 2 hours you'll be gone." Dad hadn't come home that night, but when I climbed through the back window with my suitcase, I saw him sitting at the bottom of the stone steps, smoking a cigarette. He insisted on carrying the suitcase for me, and we set off down Little Hobart Street and around the old road. The empty streets were damp. Every now and then Dad would look over at me and wink, or make a talking sound with his tongue as if I were a horse and he was urging me on. It seemed to make him feel like he was doing what a father should, plucking up his daughter's courage, helping her face the terrors of the unknown. We got to the station. Dad turned to me. "Honey, life in New York may not be as easy as you think it's going to be." "I can handle it," I told him. Dad reached into his pocket and pulled out his favorite jackknife, the one with the horn handle and the blade of the blue German steel that we'd used for demon hunting. "I'll feel better knowing you have this." He pressed the knife into my hand. The bus turned down the street and stopped with a hiss of compressed air in front of the Trailways station. The driver opened up the luggage compartment and slid my suitcase in next to the others. I hugged Dad. When our cheeks touched, and I breathed in his smell of tobacco, Vitalis, and whiskey, I realized he'd shaved for me. "If things don't work out, you can always come home," he said. "I'll be here for you. You know that, don't you?" "I know." I knew that in his way, he would be. I also knew I'd never be coming back. Only a few passengers were on the bus, so I got a good seat next to the window. The driver closed the door and we pulled out. At first I resolved not to turn around. I wanted to look ahead to where I was going and not back at what I was leaving. But then I turned anyway. Dad was lighting a cigarette. I waved and he waved back. Then he shoved his hands in his pockets, the cigarette dangling from his mouth, and stood there slightly stoop-shouldered and distracted-looking. I wondered if he was remembering how he, too, had left Welch, full of vinegar, at age 17, and just as convinced as I was now that he'd never return. I wondered if he was hoping that his favorite girl would come back, or if he was hoping that, unlike him, she would make it out for good. I reached into my pocket and touched the horn-handled jackknife and then waved again. Dad just stood there. He grew smaller and smaller, and then we turned a corner and he was gone. Chapter 4, New York City. It was dusk when I got my first glimpse of it off in the distance beyond a ridge. All I could see were the spires and the blocky tops of buildings, and then we reached the crest of the ridge, and there, across a wide river, was a huge island jammed tip to tip with skyscrapers, their glass glowing like fire in the setting sun. My heart began to race, and my palms grew damp. I walked down the bus aisle to the tiny restroom in the rear and washed up in the metal basin. I studied my face in the mirror and wondered what New Yorkers would think when they looked at me. Would they see an Appalachian hick? A tall, gawky girl? Still all elbows and knees and jutting teeth? For years, Dad had been telling me I had an inner beauty. Most people didn't see it. I had trouble seeing it myself, but Dad was always saying he could damn well see it, and that's what mattered. I hoped when New Yorkers looked at me, they would see whatever it was that Dad saw. When the bus pulled into the terminal, I collected my suitcase and walked to the middle of the station. A blur of hurrying bodies streamed past me, leaving me feeling like a stone in a creek. And then I heard someone calling my name. He was a pale guy with thick, black-framed glasses that made his eyes look tiny. His name was Evan, and he was a friend of Lori's. She was at work and had asked him to come meet me. Evan offered to carry my suitcase and led me out to the street, a noisy place with crowds backed up, waiting to cross the intersection, cars jammed together, and papers blowing every which way. I followed him right into the thick of it. After one block, Evan put down my suitcase. "This is heavy," he said. "What do you have in here?" "My coal collection." He looked at me blankly. "I'm just funning with you," I said, and punched him in the shoulder. Evan wasn't too quick on the uptake, but I took that as a good sign. There was no reason for me to be automatically in awe of the wit and intellect of these New Yorkers. I picked up the suitcase. Evan did not insist I give it back to him. In fact, he seemed sort of relieved that I was carrying it. We continued on down the block, and he kept glancing at me sideways. "You West Virginia girls are one tough breed," he said. "You got that right," I told him. Evan dropped me off at a German restaurant called Zum Zum. Lori was behind the counter carrying 4 beer steins in each hand. Her hair in twin buns and speaking in a thick German accent because she explained later it increased tips. "Dies ist mein Sister," she called out to the men at one of her tables. They raised their beer steins and shouted, "Welcome to New Yorkin." And I don't speak German, sorry. I didn't know any German, so I said grazie. They all got a chuckle out of that. Lori was in the middle of her shift, so I went out to wander the streets. I got lost a couple of times and had to ask directions. People have been warning me for months about how rude New Yorkers were. It was true. I learned that night if you tried to stop them on the street, a lot of them kept on walking, shaking their heads. Those who did stop didn't look at you at first. They gazed off down the block, their faces closed. But as soon as they realized you weren't trying to hustle them or panhandle money, they warmed right up. They looked you in the eye and gave you detailed instructions about how to get to the Empire State Building. You went up 9 blocks, made a right, cut across 2 blocks, so on. They even drew you maps. New Yorkers, I figured, just pretended to be unfriendly. Later, Lori and I took a subway down to Greenwich Village and walked over to the Evangeline, a women's hostel where she'd been living. The first night I woke up at 3 a.m. and saw the sky all lit up a bright orange. I wondered if there was a big fire somewhere. But in the morning, Lori told me that the orange glow came from the air pollution refracting the light off the streets and buildings. The night sky here, she said, always had that color. What it meant was that in New York, you could never see the stars. But Venus wasn't a star. I wondered if I'd be able to see it. The very next day, I landed a job at a hamburger joint on 14th Street. After taxes and Social Security, I'd be taking home over $80 a week. I'd spent a lot of time imagining what New York would be like, but the one thing that had never occurred to me was that the opportunities would come so easily. Aside from having to wear those embarrassing red and yellow uniforms with matching floppy hats, I loved the job. The lunch and dinner rushes were always exciting, with the lines backing up at the counter, the cashier shouting orders over the microphones, the grill guys shoveling hamburgers through the flame-broiling conveyor belt, everyone running from the fixings counter to the drink station to the infrared fries warmer, staying on top of the orders, the manager jumping in to help whenever a crisis cropped up. We got 20% off our meals, and for the first few weeks there, I had a cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake every day for lunch.